the leaves have fallen, the temperature outside is perfect, and it's just about time for Turkey Day in the US. While American Thanksgiving itself has a questionable origin and history, wrestling on the holiday has an incredibly storied history, with some of its most memorable matches and infamous moments occurring on that Thursday. Wrestling on Thanksgiving, it turns out, is just as traditional as watching the Detroit Lions lose while eating pumpkin pie. So here is a pro wrestling history of Thanksgiving. If you're a child of the late 80s and early 90s like myself, then you grew up with Survivor Series being the Thanksgiving night or Thanksgiving Eve tradition. Survivor Series 1993 was my first live event on Thanksgiving Eve. So, the event holds a very special place in my heart. But the WWF didn't come up with the idea. When they launched the pay-per-view Spectacular in 1987, wrestling on Thanksgiving had already been a territory staple for 30 years. The first known show held on the holiday was by Jim Barnett, who promoted Indiana back in 1959. The show sold out, and the next year in 1960, the AWA and Jim Crockett Sr. would follow suit. And they would be the only two territories to carry on the events as a central part of their calendar for decades. Verne Gagne would run Thanksgiving night every year from 1960 until 1987, when their business overall started to take a dive. The only exception was in 1972, when they ran the Saturday after Thanksgiving. Year after year featured sold-out shows of 10,000 plus, with main events featuring Verne Gagne, Nick Bockwinkel, The Crusher, and Larry Hennig. The peak of these shows, of course, being during Hulk Hogan's run with the territory. Thanksgiving night in 1981 saw over 17,000 fans show up to the St. Paul Civic Center to see Hogan versus Jesse Ventura in an arm wrestling contest. Not a match, arm wrestling. But by 1985, the WWF had found its way west and went head-to-head with the AWA on Thanksgiving. Verne & Co. drew just over 14,000, while Vince managed to attract a slightly larger crowd of 15,000. Just 2 years later, the holiday crowd had dwindled to a tiny 1,800 at the Minneapolis Auditorium, with Greg Gagne versus Curt Hennig for the AWA World title in the main event, bringing an end to the Thanksgiving Day tradition in the Twin Cities. However, nowhere was Thanksgiving and wrestling more tied together than in Greensboro, North Carolina. The Crockett's would host Thanksgiving night shows every year, also from 1960 until 1987, when JCP moved Starrcade to Chicago, but more on that later. In fact, the first wrestling event held in the historic Greensboro Coliseum was the Thanksgiving night show in 1961. A local paper even commented in 1984 that, in Greensboro, Thanksgiving has become synonymous with the spectacle of big men hurling each other about in a small ring in front of thousands. Wrestling has become a part of Thanksgiving in this city for more than a quarter of a century. In 1983, Jim Crockett Promotions gave their Thanksgiving night show the title of Starrcade. Over the next several years, Starrcade would become one of the premier events of the year. Again, wrestling had become so embedded in Greensboro on Thanksgiving that when they moved Starrcade 87 to Chicago, it was considered disastrous. Ric Flair reflected on the move as a key moment in JCP's demise. The show may have suffered from an unfamiliar crowd, but there was something else that year that helped put an end to this long-standing tradition. The launch of WWF Survivor Series. Now, this story could be a whole video on its own, but essentially, Vince laid down an ultimatum to the cable companies: refuse to air Starrcade or lose the rights to air WrestleMania in 1988. All but 4 companies caved and aired Survivor Series instead. And it worked. Survivor Series had over 350,000 buys, and Starrcade had well under 20,000. It really was a disastrous outing. While the pay-per-view was moved to Chicago, Greensboro still got a live card that same night prior to Starrcade going on air, continuing the Thanksgiving night tradition. The crowd of 6,000 saw a card that featured Ivan Koloff versus Mighty Wilbur, Hiro Matsuda versus Kevin Sullivan, and a women's battle royal. Starrcade followed on closed circuit. This would be the end of Jim Crockett Promotions on Thanksgiving night, as Starrcade in 1988 would be moved to December, far away from the new holiday tradition, Survivor Series. And from this point, you can pretty much figure out what happens. It's all been discussed and reviewed to death. Survivor Series becomes one of WWF's Big Four. It was the setting for both iconic debuts and controversial departures, and even at one point was set for cancellation. but the last few years, it's made a major comeback and has been a highlight of the year. And this year, we finally get War Games. In the years since Survivor Series has moved further and further away from Thanksgiving night, that gap has been filled both on the holiday itself and Thanksgiving Eve. WWE SmackDown in its Thursday night years would celebrate the big day with a feast for the superstars that somehow always ended up in a food fight. TNA was able to top WWE in ridiculousness while celebrating Thanksgiving. In the mid-2000s, they really went all out for holiday shows. They never shied away from ridiculous stipulations, gimmicks, and silly non-wrestling segments. And Turkey Day was no different, as we got multiple turkey soup matches and even an Angle family Thanksgiving dinner, with Kurt dressed as a pilgrim. Good stuff. AEW, while less over the top, has found its own way to celebrate on Thanksgiving Eve the last few years. And yes, of course that means Orange Cassidy dressed as a turkey. And I haven't even mentioned the other territories that ran Thanksgiving occasionally or very briefly. Promotions like Georgia Championship Wrestling, World Class, and Smoky Mountain. And we can't forget the various independent companies around the country that have made Thanksgiving week shows a part of their event calendar. Are there any promotions in your area running Thanksgiving week? Let me know in the comments. Pro wrestling is supposed to be fun, and nowhere else is that fun highlighted more than on holiday shows. Whether it's turkeys, gravy bowls, food fights, or just great in-ring action. If you tune into wrestling on Thanksgiving, you're going to be in for a great time. I'm Scott from WrestleSpective. Thanks for watching.
The whole world's thanking you. Thanking us for thanking you.
Glenn.
Kill the turkey.
Glenn.